We won the battle for the house, but did we lose the war for our family? Hey everyone! Welcome to Tell Me Reddit, the channel where we dive into the most interesting, dramatic, and unbelievable stories from Reddit. Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like to support the content. It really helps us bring you more amazing stories. So sit back, relax, and let's jump into another incredible Reddit story. I stood on the front porch, my calloused hands gripping a cup of lukewarm coffee, staring out at the land that had been in my family for 3 generations. The early morning light bathed the house in a golden hue, making the peeling paint and sagging porch steps seem almost charming. I could hear the rustling of the old oak trees lining the driveway, their branches whispering secrets to the wind. This was home. Inside, the sound of laughter echoed from the kitchen. My 5-year-old son, Jacob, was playing with his little sister, Emma, while my wife, Sarah, flipped pancakes on the griddle. The smell of butter and syrup mingled in the air, a temporary escape from the heavy weight pressing down on my chest. I forced a smile as I stepped inside, ruffling Jacob's hair on my way to the table. "Morning, Daddy!" he beamed, his bright blue eyes filled with innocence. "Morning, buddy," I replied, kissing Emma's forehead as she giggled. I glanced at Sarah, who gave me a small, tired smile. The dark circles under her eyes told me she hadn't slept well. We both knew why. The letter from the bank sat on the counter, unopened but looming like a dark cloud over our morning. The last notice. The one that would determine whether we would keep our home or lose it forever. I'd been working double shifts at the construction site, picking up odd jobs on the weekends, anything to scrape together enough money to make the payments. But it was never enough. The debt was a noose tightening around our necks, and we were running out of time. Sarah set a plate of pancakes in front of me, her movements precise but slow, as if weighed down by unseen chains. "You gonna open it?" she asked quietly, nodding toward the letter. I exhaled through my nose, staring at the envelope like it might explode. "After breakfast." She didn't argue. She never did. Not anymore. The fights used to be loud, full of shouting and frustration, but now they were quiet, filled with long silences and unspoken fears. Jacob noticed the tension. He wasn't old enough to understand the specifics, but he could sense the stress lingering in the air like smoke. "Are we okay, Daddy?" he asked, his voice small. I forced another smile, though it felt like it might crack my face in half. "Of course, buddy. Everything's gonna be just fine." Lying to him felt like swallowing glass, but what else could I do? Tell him the truth? That we might be packing up our lives in a few weeks? That his bedroom, the one with the rocket ship stickers and glow-in-the-dark stars, might belong to someone else soon? No. I had to hold it together, at least for him. After breakfast, Sarah cleared the plates while I took the envelope and stepped onto the porch. My fingers hesitated at the seal before I finally ripped it open. Final notice. My stomach clenched. The amount due was highlighted in bold, a number so large it made my head spin. A lump formed in my throat as I reread the letter, hoping the words would change. Sarah appeared beside me, her arms crossed over her chest. "How bad?" I swallowed hard. "They're giving us 30 days. She closed her eyes briefly, then nodded, as if she'd already known. "We'll figure something out." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But as I looked out over our land, the place where my grandfather built his first barn, where my father taught me how to fish, where Jacob took his first steps, I felt a sinking dread settle deep in my bones. We were running out of options. And time was running out. The first time I truly understood what it meant to feel helpless was 5 years ago, standing in a dingy, fluorescent-lit office with a contract in my hand and a man across the desk smiling like he already owned my soul. "Look, Nathan," the man, Greg, his name was, said, tapping the paper with his pen. "This is an opportunity, not a burden. Quick cash, easy repayment terms. A few months and you're clear." I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. Sarah and I had just welcomed Jacob into the world. Our savings were already stretched thin, and then the medical bills hit, Expenses that insurance didn't cover, costs that kept piling up like an avalanche. I was drowning, and Greg had thrown me what looked like a lifeline. A high-interest loan. Short-term, he had called it. Just enough to get back on our feet. I signed. I didn't read the fine print. I didn't want to. I saw the numbers, the promise of relief, and I took it. The money helped, for a little while. It paid off the hospital bills, got us through a few rough months. But the interest, it grew faster than I could manage. And when I couldn't make the payments, Greg's friendly smile disappeared. The calls started, then the threats. He sold my debt to another lender, then another, until I didn't even know who I owed anymore. But they all wanted the same thing, more money than I had. Sarah had begged me to tell her what was going on, but I had kept it from her for too long. By the time she found out, we were already buried. The arguments started then. Not just about the debt, but about everything. Trust. Responsibility. Fear. I had promised to take care of our family, and I had failed. Now, 5 years later, that failure was staring me in the face again. I could still feel the weight of that contract in my hands, the pen pressing into the paper like it was carving my fate. I clenched my fists, the memory burning hot in my chest. I wasn't that man anymore. I wouldn't make that mistake again. But as I looked back at the final notice in my hand, I couldn't help but wonder, was I already too late? The phone rang. Wells Fargo. I picked up, my throat dry. Mr. Carter. The voice on the other end was sharp, clipped, utterly devoid of warmth. This is Diane Reynolds from Wells Fargo. I assume you've received your final notice. I just need a little more time. We've already granted extensions. She interrupted, her tone like ice. Frankly, Mr. Carter, you're out of favors. I have work lined up, I argued, gripping the phone tighter. There's a big contract I'm supposed to start in 2 weeks, and the first paycheck alone will cover a good chunk of what I owe. If I can just get a 60-day extension. That's not how this works, Diane cut in flatly. Your due date is in 30 days. Not 60. Not 45. 30. But I can pay, I nearly shouted, heat rising in my face. I'm not trying to run from this. I just need the bank to work with me here. She sighed like she had heard this story 1,000 times before. Mr. Carter, we are not in the business of waiting on supposed payments. We are in the business of receiving actual payments. Come on, I pleaded. I've already made partial payments. I've done everything I can. You've done everything you can? She echoed, amusement creeping into her voice. Then why are you still in this situation? I clenched my jaw. Because life happens. Because I have 2 kids. Because you made bad financial decisions. She finished coldly. And unfortunately, bad decisions have consequences. I felt my grip tighten on the phone. I just need some time. Well, Mr. Carter, unfortunately, time is a luxury you no longer have. There was a slight pause before she delivered the final blow. If you fail to pay by the deadline, foreclosure proceedings will begin immediately. No exceptions. I took a deep breath, struggling to keep my composure. This is my home. No, Mr. Carter, she said, and I could practically hear the smirk in her voice. It's the bank's home. Until you pay. The line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, my heart pounding, my mind racing. I had begged, I had reasoned, I had even tried to show them that I wasn't some deadbeat trying to skirt responsibility. But none of it had mattered. Wells Fargo was coming from my home. And I was running out of ways to stop them. Sarah was waiting for me when I hung up the phone, her arms folded tightly across her chest. What did they say? I sank onto the couch, rubbing my temples. 30 days. No extensions. Her face was unreadable, but I could see the tension in her jaw. So that's it? We're just supposed to let them take our home? No, I said quickly. I'll figure something out. Sarah let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. That's what you said last time. And the time before that. I looked up at her, feeling a sharp pang of guilt. She wasn't wrong. Every time we had hit a financial wall, I had promised her I'd find a way over it. And every time, the wall had only gotten taller. What do you want me to say? I asked, my voice weary. That I have the answer? Because I don't. But I'm trying, Sarah. I'm doing everything I can. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. I know you are, Nathan. But it's not just about you trying. It's about what happens when trying isn't enough. I stood up, my frustration bubbling over. What do you want me to do, Sarah? Rob a bank? Sell my soul? Because unless you've got a better idea, all I can do is keep looking for work and praying something comes through. Sarah flinched, and immediately I regretted my tone. She turned away, gripping the edge of the counter. I sold my wedding ring yesterday. The words hit me like a freight train. I stared at her, my stomach dropping. What? She held out her hand, and sure enough, her finger was bare. Pawn shop gave me $800 for it. I was going to tell you, but She let out a shaky breath. I couldn't stand to see your face when I did. I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. That ring had been in her family for generations. She had once told me it was the only thing of her grandmother's she had left. And now it was gone. I swallowed hard. Sarah, you shouldn't have done that. She turned to face me, her eyes burning with frustration. What else was I supposed to do? Sit here and watch everything we built crumble? Watch you break yourself trying to fix something that's beyond fixing? I exhaled slowly, trying to keep my emotions in check. We'll get it back. I promised. As soon as we're back on our feet, we'll buy it back. Sarah gave me a sad smile. Nathan, if we lose this house, that ring won't matter. None of this will. The weight of her words settled deep in my chest. For the first time, I realized just how close we were to losing everything. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I had the strength to stop it. The rain drummed against the roof, filling the silence between us. Sarah sat across the table, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. I knew what she was thinking. What if we sell the car? She finally said, her voice careful, as if she were testing the waters before diving in. I shook my head. We need the car, Sarah. How else am I supposed to get to work? She leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. We have 2 cars, Nathan. You can take mine. I ran a hand over my face, feeling the exhaustion settle deeper into my bones. Your mother is sick. What if you need to get to her? What if the kids need something? We can't just... I already called my sister, she interrupted. She said she'll help if I need a ride. I stared at her, the weight of her words pressing down on me. Selling the car would buy us some time. It wouldn't fix everything, but it would keep the wolves at bay for a little longer. But what happens next month? I asked, my voice quieter now. What happens when that money runs out and we're still in the same hole? Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I don't know, she admitted. But I know I can't just sit here and watch everything fall apart while we do nothing. I looked away, my jaw tightening. I'll figure something out. You keep saying that, she whispered, her voice breaking. And I keep believing you. But Nathan, I don't think I can believe it anymore. Her words sliced through me, leaving an ache so deep I wasn't sure if I'd ever recover from it. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that I had a plan, that everything would be okay. But I didn't have a plan. And nothing was okay. The kids' laughter drifted in from the other room, a stark contrast to the storm raging between us. I took a slow breath, then nodded. We'll sell the car. Sarah blinked, almost as if she hadn't expected me to agree. Then she nodded back, and for the first time in weeks, I saw something in her eyes that had been missing, relief. We had bought ourselves a little more time. But at what cost? The next morning, I met a man from Craigslist in the grocery store parking lot. He was younger than me, maybe early 30s, dressed too clean for someone interested in buying a 12-year-old sedan. He ran his hand along the hood, nodding like he knew what he was looking for. I can do $2,500, he said casually, as if he wasn't gutting me with the offer. I had posted the car for $3,500, It was already low. I fought to keep my voice steady. It's worth more than that. He shrugged. Maybe to you. I swallowed hard. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was lowballing me, that I needed the money more than he needed the car. But desperation is a smell, and I was practically drowning in it. He knew it. I exhaled sharply and nodded. Fine. We exchanged paperwork. He handed me a stack of cash, crisp bills that felt heavier than they should have. As I watched him drive away in a car that had once been our safety net, I clenched the money in my fist, forcing myself to believe that this was the right thing to do. That it wasn't just another loss in a long line of losses. But deep down, I knew the truth. This was just the beginning. That night, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, counting the cash while I stood by the sink, gripping the counter so hard my knuckles turned white. It's enough for this month's payment, she said quietly. And groceries. Maybe even a little extra for savings. I nodded, staring at the sink. Yeah. She set the money down and looked up at me. You did the right thing. I let out a dry laugh. Then why does it feel like I failed? Sarah pushed back her chair and came to stand beside me, placing a hand on my arm. Because it's not fair. Because you're doing everything you can, and it still doesn't feel like enough. I turned to face her, my chest tightening. What if it never is? She hesitated, then reached up to cup my face. Then we'll keep going anyway. I closed my eyes, letting her warmth ground me. We were still standing, still fighting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running out of things to sacrifice. I woke up to the sound of Jacob crying. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. But then I heard it again, sharp, muffled sobs coming from the hallway. I pulled myself out of bed, rubbing my face as I followed the sound. Jacob sat on the floor just outside his room, his little body curled up, his hands gripping his pajama pants. His shoulders shook as he tried to stifle his cries. Hey, buddy. I crouched down beside him. What's wrong? He sniffled and wiped at his face. I heard you and Mommy talking last night. My chest tightened. What did you hear? He hesitated. That we don't have enough money. That we might lose our house. I swallowed hard. Jacob. Are we gonna be okay? His voice was so small, so full of fear, that it shattered me. I forced a smile, though my throat burned with emotion. Of course we are. You don't need to worry about that, okay? That's Daddy's job. He looked up at me, his blue eyes searching mine. But what if you can't fix it? For the first time, I had no words. No empty promises to soothe him. Because deep down, I was afraid he was right. Sarah appeared in the hallway, her face pale. She knelt beside Jacob, pulling him into her arms. Baby, we love you so much. No matter what happens, we'll always take care of you. Jacob clung to her, nodding against her shoulder. And I sat there, feeling more helpless than I ever had before. Because hope was slipping away, and I didn't know how to stop it. Later that morning, Sarah and I sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee in silence. The weight of the night's conversation hung between us. We can't let them see us breaking, Sarah said finally, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. If Jacob's already this scared, what happens if things get worse? I sighed, rubbing my temples. I don't know, Sarah. But I can't pretend everything's fine when it isn't. She reached for my hand, her fingers lacing through mine. We'll figure it out. We always do. I nodded, but I wasn't sure if I believed it anymore. That afternoon, I went to the hardware store, hoping to pick up a side gig with some contractors I used to work with. I ran into Dave, an old coworker, as he loaded bags of cement into his truck. Nate, man, haven't seen you in a while. How's the family? I forced a smile. They're good. Just trying to stay busy. He nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. You looking for work? Yeah, I admitted. Anything you got, even if it's just weekend shifts. Dave frowned. I'd hire you in a heartbeat, man, but they're cutting back on hours. Company's tightening up. Of course they were. Just my luck. Look, he said, hesitating. I know a guy, kind of off-the-books work. Pays in cash. Not exactly legal, but nothing too bad. Just moving some stuff around, no questions asked. I swallowed hard. The old me, the desperate me, would have jumped at the offer. But I had sworn to Sarah I wouldn't go down that road again. I appreciate it, Dave, I said, forcing a smile. But I can't risk it. He nodded, but I could tell he thought I was being stupid. Maybe I was. When I got home, Sarah was sitting on the couch, staring at her phone. My mom's getting worse, she said, her voice hollow. I need to go see her. I exhaled. How bad? They don't know if she'll make it through the month. The words hit like a punch to the gut. We barely had enough money for groceries, let alone a plane ticket. We'll figure something out, I said, but I could see in her eyes that she didn't believe me. And for the first time, either did I. The house felt heavier than usual, like the walls were pressing in, suffocating me. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the pile of unpaid bills, the foreclosure notice pinned to the top like a death sentence. 30 days. That was all we had left. Sarah had barely spoken to me since yesterday. After the news about her mother, she had retreated into herself. I didn't blame her. She wanted to be there, to hold her mother's hand, to say goodbye. But how could we afford a plane ticket when we were barely keeping the lights on? Jacob and Emma were playing in the living room, oblivious to the storm brewing in our lives. I envied their innocence. They still believed that Daddy could fix anything, that Mommy's hugs could make the world right again. I needed to find a way out. Fast. I spent the morning making calls. Construction sites, warehouses, even an old mechanic buddy. Nothing. No one was hiring, or if they were, they weren't looking for someone desperate enough to take anything. By noon, I was pacing the front porch, my mind racing with ideas, bad ones. Dave's offer from the other day kept creeping back in. Off-the-books work, cash in hand, no questions asked. It wouldn't be forever, just long enough to scrape together enough to stop the bank from taking the house. I pulled out my phone and hovered over Dave's number. One call. That's all it would take. I thought of Sarah, the way she had looked at me the last time I had made a bad decision to save us. The hurt, the disappointment. I had promised her I would never go back to that. I put the phone away. There had to be another way. When Sarah finally spoke, it wasn't what I expected. I asked my sister for money. I looked up from the bills, surprised. What? She sighed, rubbing her temples. I didn't tell you because I knew you wouldn't want me to. But we're out of options, Nathan. I clenched my fists. I hated this. I hated the idea of taking a handout, of feeling like a failure who couldn't take care of his own family. How much? I asked, my voice tight. Enough for the mortgage payment. And a ticket. A bitter taste filled my mouth. So what? We just take the money and pretend we're not drowning? Her eyes flashed. Do you have a better idea? I had nothing. I looked away, swallowing my pride along with the lump in my throat. We'll pay her back, I muttered. Sarah let out a shaky breath. I know. For the first time in weeks, the weight on my chest loosened just a little. We had bought time. But at what cost? The morning was cold, a bitter wind cutting through my jacket as I stepped outside. I hadn't slept much, and my body felt like it was running on fumes. The money from Sarah's sister had bought us time, but it wasn't a solution. We were still on the edge, one wrong step from losing everything. I needed a miracle. Halfway through my second cup of coffee, my phone rang. I almost didn't answer. Another bill collector? Another rejection from one of the jobs I'd begged for? But when I saw the name on the screen, my heart skipped a beat. Mike Holloway. Mike and I had worked together years ago before he moved out of state. He had been a foreman at a contracting company, one of the best guys I'd ever worked for. I hadn't spoken to him in years. I took a deep breath and answered. Mike? Nate. Man, it's been a long time. I could hear the hum of heavy machinery in the background. He was at a job site. My stomach tightened. Was he calling just to catch up, or did he have something for me? Yeah, I said, forcing a smile into my voice. Been too long. I heard through the grapevine that you were looking for work, he said, getting straight to the point. Is that true? I swallowed. Yeah. Things have been rough. Mike didn't push for details. I'm in town for a few weeks. My company landed a big project here, and I need guys I can trust. It's long hours, tough work, but the pay is solid. You in? For a second, I thought I had misheard him. A job. A real job. How soon do you need me? I asked. Tomorrow morning. 7 sharp. We'll be working on site, laying foundation for a commercial build. It's going to run for a few months at least. A few months. Enough time to dig ourselves out of this hole. I'm in, I said before he could change his mind. Good man, Mike said. I'll text you the details. When I hung up, my hands were shaking. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. A way out. A real shot at fixing this. Sarah was in the kitchen when I walked back inside. She looked up from her cup of tea, her face tired, but when she saw my expression, she sat up straighter. What happened? I couldn't stop the grin from spreading across my face. I got a job. Her eyes widened. What? Mike Holloway. He's in town with a construction project, and he needs workers. It's good money, Sarah. Steady money. For a moment, she just stared at me, and then, to my surprise, tears welled in her eyes. She let out a shaky laugh, covering her mouth with her hand. Oh my God, Nathan! I walked over, pulling her into my arms. She clung to me, her body shaking with relief. I told you I'd find a way, I whispered against her hair. She pulled back just enough to look at me. I never stopped believing in you. I kissed her forehead, feeling, for the first time in months, like I could breathe again. We weren't out of the woods yet. But for the first time in a long time, there was a path forward. The alarm blared at 5:30 a.m., jolting me awake. For a moment, I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, my body heavy with exhaustion. But I couldn't afford to rest, not today. I had work. Real work. The kind that could save my family from losing everything. Sarah stirred beside me, her hand reaching for mine under the blankets. You got this, she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. I squeezed her fingers gently before pulling away. I have to. Quietly, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood. The house was still dark, the kind of quiet that made me hyper-aware of every creak in the floorboards as I moved. I tiptoed down the hallway, pausing by Jacob's door. It was cracked open just enough for me to see him sprawled across his bed, his tiny chest rising and falling with steady breaths. Emma's room was the same, peaceful, untouched by the storm brewing in the real world. I exhaled slowly. I wasn't going to let them lose this house. I refused. By 6:45 a.m., I was pulling up to the job site, the nervous energy thrumming through me like an overcharged wire. The place was already alive with movement, trucks rolling in, forklifts beeping, men calling out to one another. The scent of fresh lumber mixed with the sharp tang of diesel, bringing back memories I hadn't realized I missed. Mike spotted me from across the lot and waved me over. Nate! Glad you made it. I nodded, gripping my work gloves a little tighter. Wouldn't miss it. He handed me a hard hat and clapped me on the shoulder. We're laying rebar and pouring concrete today. You up for it? I rolled my shoulders, already feeling the old rhythm settle back in. Absolutely. Mike grinned. Good. Let's get to it. The first few hours were brutal. I had been out of the game for too long, and my body reminded me with every lift, every twist, every hammer strike. My hands blistered fast, my back screamed in protest, but I pushed through. Every drop of sweat, every ache, it was worth it if it meant keeping my family under one roof. By noon, I had stripped off my jacket, my shirt damp with sweat. The sun had climbed high, baking the job site in relentless heat. I wiped my forehead with the back of my glove just as Mike walked over, a bottle of water in each hand. He tossed one to me. You still standing? I let out a breathless chuckle. Barely. Mike grinned. You haven't lost your touch. I cracked open the water, downing half of it in one go. Feels good to be back. Mike's expression shifted slightly, and I knew something was coming. He gestured toward the office trailer. Come grab lunch. We need to talk. A knot formed in my stomach. That phrase was rarely good news. Inside the trailer, the air conditioning was a welcome relief from the midday heat. Mike leaned against the desk, arms crossed, watching me as I took a seat. Look, Nate, he started, voice measured. I know things have been rough for you. I stiffened. I'm good, Mike. I appreciate the job. He sighed. I'm just gonna be straight with you. The company's hiring full-time. With benefits. Steady pay, good hours. My breath caught in my throat. Full-time work. Not just a temp gig, real stability. What's the catch? I asked, my voice wary. Mike hesitated. It's out of town. We're moving to another site in 3 weeks. You'd have to travel. I sat back in my chair, my pulse thudding in my ears. Travel. That meant leaving Sarah and the kids behind. Missing Jacob's soccer games. Missing bedtime stories with Emma. Missing everything that made this fight worth it in the first place. But if I turned it down... I rubbed a hand over my face. How long would I be gone? Depends. Could be a couple months. Could be longer. You'd come home when you could. I let out a slow breath, staring at the floor. This job could save us. But it could also take me away from everything I was trying to protect. Mike gave me a moment before speaking again. I get it, Nate. It's not an easy call. Just don't take too long. They need an answer soon. I shook his hand and left the trailer, my stomach churning. Save our home, or stay with my family? There was no easy choice. The house was silent when I got home. Too silent. Normally, I'd hear Jacob's excited footsteps or Emma's little giggles from the living room. But tonight there was nothing but the distant hum of the refrigerator and the rain tapping against the windows. I set my bag down, my body aching from the long shift. My mind was even more exhausted. The job was everything we needed, steady work, good pay, but the cost of taking it was almost unbearable. Leaving meant missing moments with my family I'd never get back. But staying meant risking losing the roof over our heads. I ran a hand over my face and stepped into the kitchen. Sarah sat at the table, her arms folded, her eyes heavy with something I couldn't place. Anger? Sadness? Maybe both. You're late, she said softly. Yeah, I muttered, grabbing a glass from the cupboard. Got caught up at the site. Sarah nodded, staring down at the tabletop. Mike called. I froze mid-pour. I set the water down slowly and turned to her. What did he say? She let out a slow breath. He said they need an answer. Now. I swallowed hard. I was going to tell you. When? She snapped, finally looking at me. Her eyes burned with frustration. After you had already decided? I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. I needed time to think. She pushed her chair back abruptly, standing. You think I don't? You think I don't lay awake every night wondering what happens next? Wondering if I'm going to have to pack up our kids and move into a shelter because we have nowhere else to go? I flinched. Sarah. No. She shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. I need to know, Nathan. Are you taking the job or not? I exhaled slowly. If I do, I'll be gone for months. I know, she whispered. I ran a hand through my hair. And if I don't, we lose the house. Sarah looked away, gripping the back of her chair like she needed the support. So those are our choices? Lose our home or lose you? The weight of her words hit me like a gut punch. I didn't know how to answer. I don't want to leave you, I admitted. I don't want to miss Jacob's games. I don't want to miss Emma's first real sentences. I don't want to miss us. Sarah wiped at her eyes. Then don't. I let out a bitter laugh. And then what? We live out of our car? She didn't have an answer for that. Neither did I. The front door creaked open before either of us could speak. Jacob peeked into the kitchen, his eyes sleepy but curious. Are you guys fighting? Sarah immediately wiped her face and forced a smile. No, sweetheart. Just talking. He nodded but didn't look convinced. Daddy, are we gonna have to move? I swallowed past the lump in my throat and crouched down to his level. Not if I can help it, buddy. He thought about that for a moment, then gave me a serious nod. Okay. He turned and padded back to his room, leaving Sarah and me in silence. She exhaled shakily. You need to call Mike. I knew she was right. I just didn't know if I could handle what came next. I grabbed my phone with a shaking hand and dialed. Mike picked up after one ring. Nathan? I took a deep breath. I'll take the job. The day before I left, I spent every moment I could with my family. I took Jacob to the park, where he kicked his soccer ball between my legs, laughing every time I pretended to trip over it. Emma sat on my shoulders, her tiny hands gripping my hair as she pointed at the ducks in the pond. Sarah watched us from the picnic table, her smile warm but hiding something underneath, a sadness neither of us could put into words. That night, after the kids were asleep, Sarah and I lay in bed, facing each other in the dim light of the bedside lamp. The silence stretched between us, heavy and fragile all at once. I don't know how to do this without you, she admitted, her fingers tracing slow circles on my arm. I swallowed past the lump in my throat. You won't have to. I'll call every night. We'll figure it out. She nodded, but her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. And if something happens? If the kids get sick or... I'll come home. I promised, even though we both knew it wouldn't be that simple. No matter what. Sarah exhaled shakily and buried her face against my chest. I hate this. I held her tighter. Me too. The next morning came too soon. I kissed Emma's sleeping forehead, ruffled Jacob's hair, and stood in the doorway while Sarah held them both, her arms wrapped around their small bodies as if she could shield them from what was coming. You don't have to go, Daddy, Jacob said, rubbing his tired eyes. I crouched down and held his face between my hands. I do, buddy. But I'll be back before you know it. His lower lip trembled. Promise? I nodded, forcing a smile. Promise. Sarah walked me to the car, her hand clutching mine until the very last second. Drive safe, she whispered. I kissed her one last time, lingering, memorizing the feel of her lips, the warmth of her skin. Then, before I could second-guess myself, I got in and drove away. The job site was 4 hours away in a town I barely knew. The hotel they put us up in was nothing fancy, a bed, a small TV, a bathroom with questionable water pressure. It didn't matter. I wasn't here for comfort. Work was grueling. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. By the time I got back to my room at night, my body ached in places I didn't even know could hurt. But the paycheck at the end of each week was the only thing that mattered. I called home every night. Emma mostly babbled in the background, and Jacob gave me updates about school and his soccer games. But Sarah's voice carried the weight of the world. She told me about bills, about how Emma cried for me at bedtime, about how the house felt too big and too empty without me there. And every night, when the call ended, I sat alone in that tiny room, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had made the right choice. 2 weeks in, I started counting the days until I could visit home. 4 weeks in, I noticed a shift in Sarah's voice. She was trying to be strong, but I could hear it, she was exhausted. She was drowning in responsibilities, trying to hold everything together while I was miles away. Maybe we should have found another way, she admitted one night, her voice barely above a whisper. I gripped the phone tighter. It's temporary, Sarah. Just a few months. She let out a hollow laugh. That's what we said about the debt, too. That it was temporary. I had no response to that. By the end of the second month, I finally had enough saved to make a lump sum payment on the mortgage. I felt relief for the first time in years as I sent the money in, buying us more time, buying us hope. I called Sarah that night, expecting her to sound relieved, but instead, she just sounded tired. "That's great, Nathan," she said. But her voice lacked the joy I had hoped for. "I'll be home next weekend," I told her. "We can finally breathe a little." She hesitated, and in that silence, I felt something shift between us. "We miss you," she said finally. "The kids, me. It's not the same without you." "I know," I said, pressing my forehead against the cool hotel wall. "I hate it too," she exhaled. "I just don't know how much longer we can do this." Neither did I. The days blurred together, work, sleep, phone calls home, repeat. The physical labor was grueling, but it wasn't what wore me down. It was the silence after I hung up with Sarah. The empty hotel room. The knowledge that, despite everything I was doing, I was still losing something that money couldn't replace. I had imagined this would be hard. I hadn't imagined it would feel like this. 3 months in, I noticed Sarah wasn't answering my calls right away. Some nights I'd call, and she'd pick up, her voice strained. "Sorry, I was busy." "What's going on?" I'd ask. "Nothing," she'd say. "Just tired." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to ignore the hesitation in her voice, the forced lightness. But something was changing. Something was slipping. One night, Jacob got on the phone first. "Mommy was crying today." I sat up in bed, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Why, buddy?" He was quiet for a long time. Then, in a small voice, he said, "She said she misses you too much." I closed my eyes, my chest aching. "I miss her too. Are you coming home soon?" "I'll try, buddy. I'll try." The next night, Sarah finally admitted it. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," she whispered. "I feel like a single parent. Like I'm married to a voice on the phone." Her words cut through me like a knife. I sat at the edge of the bed, my head in my hands. "I'm doing this for us." "I know," she said. "But it doesn't feel like us anymore." I had no answer for that. By the 4th month, I had saved enough to push the foreclosure back even further. We weren't drowning anymore. But at what cost? I drove home that weekend, expecting relief. Expecting things to feel normal again. Instead, the house felt different. Jacob ran to me first, wrapping his arms around my waist. Emma followed, clinging to my leg. But Sarah stood in the doorway, arms crossed, exhaustion written in every line of her face. I pulled her into a hug, but she didn't melt into me the way she used to. She was stiff, hesitant. "I'm home," I murmured against her hair. "For how long?" she asked quietly. I pulled back, searching her face. "What does that mean?" She looked away. "I don't know how to do this anymore, Nathan. I don't know how to be a family when you're not here." I felt the ground shift beneath me. "I'm doing this for us," I repeated, my voice cracking. "For our home." She met my gaze, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. This wasn't just about money. It was about everything we had lost in the process of trying to save it. "I know," she whispered. "But I don't know if it's enough anymore." I had imagined coming home would feel like a victory. That I'd walk through the front door, hold Sarah in my arms, and for a moment, things would feel right again. But standing in our kitchen, watching her move around like I was just another guest in the house, I realized something terrible. I had been fighting to save our home, but I had no idea how to save our marriage. The first night back, we barely spoke. The kids were ecstatic to have me home, clinging to me like I might disappear at any second. But once they were asleep, the silence stretched between Sarah and me like a canyon. She sat on the edge of the bed, her back to me, staring at the floor. I sat behind her, waiting for her to say something. When she finally did, her voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear it. "I don't know how to do this, Nathan." My chest tightened. "Do what?" She turned slightly, just enough for me to see the exhaustion in her face. "Pretend that everything's fine just because you're home for a few days." I reached for her hand, but she pulled away, standing. "Sarah," She let out a shaky breath. I have been alone in this, Nathan. Raising the kids, handling the bills, lying awake every night wondering if you're okay, if we're okay. I did this for us, I said, my voice raw. To keep us afloat. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. And now that we're afloat, what's left of us? I had no answer. The next morning, I woke up to find Sarah already in the kitchen, dressed, the kids eating breakfast like it was just another day. I watched her move around, the same way she had when I left months ago, only now there was a distance in her movements. A quiet detachment. She wasn't angry. That would have been easier. Instead, she looked tired. Like she had been fighting a battle for months and didn't know if she had the strength to keep going. I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. Can we talk? She glanced at me but didn't stop making the kids' lunches. I don't know what else there is to say. I sighed. I know I haven't been here. I know this has been hell for you. But we made it, Sarah. We saved the house. She set the knife down and turned to me. We saved the house, Nathan. But I don't know if we saved us. The words hit like a gut punch. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. You still love me? Tears welled in her eyes. That's not the problem. I swallowed. Then tell me what is. She shook her head, as if she didn't even know how to explain it. I needed you, Nathan. I needed you to be here. And now I don't know if we can just go back to how things were. Fear clawed at my chest. Then tell me how to fix it. She hesitated, then whispered, I don't know if you can. That night, after the kids were asleep, I found her sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the dark sky. I sat beside her, the cool night air pressing against my skin. Remember when we used to sit out here and talk about the future? I asked. She let out a soft laugh, but there was no joy in it. Yeah. Back when we thought love was enough. I exhaled. You don't think it is anymore? She was quiet for a long time. Then, finally, she whispered, I don't know. The weight of those words crushed me. I had fought so hard to keep this house. But what was a house without the family that made it home? The days after that conversation felt like living with a ghost. Sarah and I moved around each other in the house, performing the motions of a married couple but without the closeness, without the warmth. The kids noticed it too. Jacob was quieter, watching us with cautious eyes. Emma clung to Sarah more than usual, as if sensing something was wrong. I hated it. But I didn't know how to fix it. One night, I found Sarah sitting alone in the living room, staring at a photo of us from years ago, back when we were younger, happier, before life had chipped away at us piece by piece. She didn't look up when she spoke. Do you remember that trip to the lake? I sat beside her, glancing at the picture. Yeah. Jacob was barely 2. We spent half the time chasing him around so he wouldn't fall in the water. She smiled faintly, but it faded quickly. We were so different then. I reached for her hand, hesitating before letting my fingers brush against hers. We can be again. She finally looked at me, and I saw everything in her eyes. Love, exhaustion, fear, doubt. I don't know how. The next morning, I made a decision. I woke up early, got the kids dressed, and made breakfast while Sarah was still asleep. When she finally came downstairs, rubbing her eyes, she stopped in the doorway, surprised. What's all this? She asked. A day off, I said. For you. She blinked. What? I walked over, pressing a kiss to her forehead. I'm taking the kids out for the day. You don't have to do anything. Just breathe. She opened her mouth to protest, but then, slowly, she exhaled. Okay. I took Jacob and Emma to the park, then out for ice cream, then to an old bookstore Sarah loved but never had time to visit anymore. When we got home, I cooked dinner, nothing fancy, but enough to show her that I was still here, that I still cared. When Sarah sat down at the table, watching me, something shifted in her expression. Something I hadn't seen in months. Hope. That night, we lay in bed facing each other, the space between us smaller than it had been before. I don't expect everything to be fixed overnight, I told her. But I want to try. I want to fight for this. For us. She was quiet for a long time before she whispered, "Me too." I reached for her hand, and this time, she didn't pull away. We had lost so much. But maybe, just maybe, we hadn't lost everything. The first thing I noticed was that Sarah had started smiling again, not the forced, tired smiles she had given me in the weeks before, but real ones. Small, fleeting, but real. The kind that made me believe we still had a chance. It wasn't perfect. We were still learning how to be us again. But we were trying. A month passed. Then two. The weight of the foreclosure had lifted, the job was steady, and for the first time in years, we weren't drowning. One evening, after dinner, I found Sarah sitting on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the sunset. I sat beside her, letting the silence settle between us before speaking. "You thinking about the past?" I asked. She smiled softly. "No. For the first time in a long time, I'm thinking about the future." I reached for her hand, and this time, she squeezed mine back. "What do you see?" She turned to me, her eyes full of something I hadn't seen in a long time. "Us. Still here. Still standing." I swallowed hard, emotion thick in my throat. "Yeah?" She nodded. "Yeah." The following weekend, we packed up the kids and drove out to the lake, our lake. The one from the picture she had stared at that night. The place where we had once felt so invincible, so full of dreams. Jacob ran ahead kicking a soccer ball, while Emma giggled as she stomped through the shallow water. Sarah and I sat on the dock side by side, watching them. "This feels right," she murmured. I wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "It does." She sighed, leaning into me. "Do you think we'll be okay?" I pressed a kiss to her temple. "We already are." She smiled, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I knew it was true. We had been on the edge of losing everything, our home, our family, ourselves. But somehow, we had made it through. Not because of the house. Not because of the job. But because, in the end, we had never stopped choosing each other. The end.